Hello friends, welcome to Sleepy History Channel. Today I bring another new boring history for you. Hope you like it. Subscribe to the Sleepy History Channel to get new boring history. Deep in the dense and humid jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula, the air hung heavy and still over the canopy where the ancient Maya people built their civilization. The heat was a constant and oppressive force that weighed down upon the shoulders of every man and woman and child from the moment the sun rose in the east until it finally dipped below the western horizon. The humidity was so intense that it felt like walking through a warm, damp blanket that clung to the skin and made every movement feel slower and more difficult than it should have been. For the common farmer, life was a never-ending cycle of grueling labor that began before the first light of dawn had even touched the tops of the great stone temples. They would wake in the darkness of their small thatched huts, which were made of wattle and daub, with roofs woven from dried palm fronds that rustled softly in the night breeze. The floor was packed earth that had been smoothed over generations of footsteps, but it offered little comfort against the hardness of the ground. The first task of the day was always the same, and it revolved around the most essential element of their survival, which was maize. The women would rise to kneel before the grinding stones, known as metates. They would take the kernels of corn that had been soaked in lime water overnight to soften the tough outer hulls. Then they would begin the rhythmic and backbreaking work of crushing the corn into a fine dough called masa. The sound of stone scraping against stone was the heartbeat of the morning, a repetitive and monotonous grinding noise that echoed through the village for hours on end. This work was physically demanding and caused great pain in the lower back and knees and shoulders, but it had to be done every single day without fail, because without the maize there was no food, and without food there was no life. While the women ground the corn, the men would gather their simple tools and head out into the milpa fields. The walk to the fields could be long and treacherous, winding through the thick undergrowth of the jungle, where sharp thorns and biting insects were a constant plague. The mosquitoes were relentless clouds that swarmed around their faces, and the biting flies drew blood with every sting. The heat of the day would rise quickly, and by mid-morning the sun was a punishing weight on their backs. The work in the fields was brutal in its simplicity and its difficulty. They practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, which meant they had to clear the dense jungle by hand, using only stone axes and fire. The trees of the jungle were hardwoods like mahogany and sapodilla, which were incredibly dense and difficult to cut with primitive stone tools. The sound of the axe striking the wood was dull and heavy, chop after chop after chop for hours, until the muscles in their arms burned with exhaustion and their hands were blistered and raw. Once the trees were felled, they had to wait for the dry season to burn the brush. The fires would rage and fill the air with thick, acrid smoke that stung the eyes and coated the lungs with ash. Walking through the charred fields covered in soot was like walking through a landscape of desolation. Then came the planting, which was done with a simple digging stick called a koa. The farmer would drive the stick into the dry, rocky soil to make a hole, drop in a seed, cover it with his foot, and take a step forward to repeat the motion. Step and dig and drop and cover. Step and dig and drop and cover. Thousands upon thousands of times under the blazing sun until the field was sown. There were no beasts of burden to pull plows or carry heavy loads. There were no horses or oxen or donkeys in the Maya world. Everything that needed to be moved had to be carried on the backs of human beings using a tumline, which was a strap that went across the forehead and supported the weight of the load on the back. This method compressed the spine and strained the neck muscles, causing chronic pain and skeletal deformation over a lifetime of labor. Water was another source of endless struggle. In the northern lowlands, there were no rivers or streams on the surface because the limestone bedrock swallowed all the rain. So the people had to rely on natural sinkholes called cenotes, or cisterns they carved into the rock called chultunes. Carrying water from the source to the home was a daily burden that fell upon the women and children. The clay jars filled with water were heavy and awkward, and the path from the cenote was often steep and slippery. One slip could mean a broken jar and a wasted journey. During the dry season, the water levels would drop, and the water would become stagnant and thick with algae, yet they had to drink it to survive. The fear of drought was a constant shadow over their lives. If the rains did not come on time, the crops would fail, and hunger would set in. Famine was a slow and quiet killer that stalked the villages, turning strong bodies into skeletons and silencing the laughter of children. Even in times of plenty, the diet was simple and monotonous, consisting almost entirely of corn and beans and squash. Meat was a rare luxury reserved for the elite or special occasions. The common people subsisted on a diet that filled the belly, but often left them lacking in essential nutrients, leading to anemia and stunted growth. The physical toll of this life was evident on their bodies. Their bones showed signs of arthritis and stress fractures from a young age. Their teeth were worn down by the grit of the stone grinding tools that ended up in their food. Infections and diseases were rampant in the tropical climate. A simple cut from a sharp leaf or a scrape against a rock could easily become infected in the humidity and lead to gangrene or death. There were no antibiotics or modern medicines, only herbal remedies and prayers to the gods. The gods themselves were demanding and terrifying figures who required constant nourishment in the form of blood and sacrifice. The fear of angering the gods added a psychological burden to the physical hardships of daily life. The common people lived in a state of constant obligation. They had to give a portion of their hard-earned crops to the nobility and the priesthood as tribute. They had to provide labor for the construction of the massive stone temples and palaces that rose above the jungle canopy. These great structures were built without the wheel and without metal tools. Every single stone block was quarried by hand using stone chisels and hammerstones. The sound of the quarry was a deafening cacophony of tapping and hammering that went on from dawn until dusk. The dust from the limestone filled the air and coated the skin of the workers in a white powder that dried out their throats and eyes. Once the stones were cut, they had to be dragged miles through the jungle on wooden rollers, hundreds of men pulling on thick ropes made of vines.
Straining against the immense weight, their feet sinking into the mud, their bodies slick with sweat. Inch by inch they moved the mountains of stone. If a rope snapped or a roller broke, men could be crushed in an instant. But the work did not stop. Another man would simply step into the place of the fallen, and the pulling would continue. Up the steep sides of the pyramids they carried the blocks on their backs, climbing narrow steps that were slick with rain or sweat. The danger of falling was ever present. The architects and priests watched from the shade while the commoners toiled in the sun, building monuments to a power they could never possess. Their lives were bound to the land and the seasons and the whims of the rulers. They had no freedom to travel or choose their own path. A farmer was born a farmer and would die a farmer. His children would inherit his tools and his debts and his hard life. The nights offered little respite from the brutality of the day. The jungle came alive with the sounds of predators. The jaguar prowled the darkness, and the snakes slithered through the thatch of the roofs. Sleep was heavy, but often fitful, broken by the sounds of the night or the ache of overworked muscles. The humidity never truly lifted, leaving the bedding damp and musty. The smoke from the cooking fires lingered in the huts, causing respiratory problems and coughing that echoed in the dark. Yet despite the brutality and the hardship and the endless toil, the Maya persisted. They woke up every morning before the sun. They ground their corn, they walked to their fields, they carried their stones. They bore their burdens with a stoic endurance that spanned centuries. Their lives were a testament to the sheer resilience of the human spirit in the face of an environment that tried its best to consume them. The jungle was always waiting to reclaim the land. Vines crept over the stones, roots pried apart the walls, and the forest constantly encroached on the fields. It was an eternal battle between man and nature, a slow and quiet war fought with stone axes and digging sticks, a war that left its mark on every bone and every stone and every memory of the ancient past. This was the reality of their existence, not the glory of kings and jade and feathers, but the sweat and the dust and the aching back, the hunger in the belly and the callus on the hand, the silence of the forest and the heat of the sun. A life of beautiful and terrible simplicity that ground on, like the stones upon the maize, day after day, year after year, cycle after cycle, until the jungle finally swallowed them whole and left only the stones to tell the story of their struggle. Beyond the fields and the daily grind of survival, there was the constant looming threat of conflict between the rival city-states. Warfare was not a distant rumor, but a terrifying reality that could descend upon a village at any moment. The sound of conch-shell trumpets echoing through the trees signaled not a parade, but a raid. For the common people, war did not mean glory or medals. It meant the burning of their homes, and the theft of their crops, and the capture of their bodies. The goal of Maya warfare was often not to kill on the battlefield, but to take live prisoners for labor or for ritual sacrifice. A farmer working in his milpa could be seized and bound and marched for days to a foreign city, where he would lose his name and his family and his freedom forever. The fear of capture kept people close to their settlements and made the jungle feel like a place of hidden eyes and silent dangers. The weapons they faced were brutal in their design. Spears tipped with jagged flint, and wooden clubs embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades that could sever a limb with a single blow. Even if one survived the raid, the aftermath was a struggle of rebuilding from the ashes, putting new thatch on the roof and replanting the trampled corn before the rains came. The spiritual world was just as perilous as the physical one, because the Maya believed that the sun would cease to rise if the gods were not fed, and the food of the gods was the vital essence found within human blood. The priests used stingray spines and obsidian blades to pierce their own tongues and ears and genitals in a ritual of self-sacrifice that was horrifyingly painful, yet considered absolutely necessary to keep the universe in balance. For the commoner, the rituals were a spectacle of awe and terror, viewed from the plaza below the high temple steps. They watched as the smoke of burning copal incense rose into the sky, carrying the prayers of the kings. The smell of the incense was thick and sweet and cloying, mixing with the metallic scent of blood and the humid rot of the jungle floor. The ball game was another arena where life and death hung in the balance, a game played with a solid rubber ball that was heavy enough to break bones and kill a man if it struck him in the wrong place. The players wore thick padding, but injuries were inevitable as they threw their bodies against the hard stone floors of the court to keep the ball in motion without using their hands or feet. The game was a reenactment of cosmic struggles, and the losers, or sometimes even the winners, could be beheaded at the end of the match as an offering to the gods. The severed heads were sometimes used as the balls for the next game, a grim reminder that life was circular and cruel. Health and medicine were primitive and often involved painful treatments. A toothache was treated by drilling a hole into the tooth with a hand drill made of stone and using jade or pyrite inlays to fill the cavity. The vibration of the drill against the skull was maddening, and there was no anesthesia to dull the sharp agony of the exposed nerve. Beauty standards in the ancient Maya world were also a source of immense physical discomfort, especially for the elite children. Almost immediately after birth, an infant's head was bound between two wooden boards to artificially deform the skull into an elongated shape that resembled an ear of corn. The pressure on the soft skull of the baby was constant and intense. Crying was ignored as the boards were tightened day after day to mold the bone permanently. They also crossed the eyes of children on purpose by dangling a bead of wax or stone in front of their nose until the eyes became permanently fixed in a cross-eyed position, which was considered a mark of beauty and status. The skin was often scarred with decorative patterns, cut with sharp blades, and rubbed with ash to create raised keloids.
The process of scarification was a test of endurance and a way to mark one's place in society. Clothing for the common people was minimal due to the heat, but the elite wore heavy and elaborate costumes made of cotton and feathers and jaguar pelts. These outfits were stiflingly hot in the tropical humidity.
Layers of fabric and heavy jade jewelry weighed them down as they stood for hours in the sun during ceremonies. The jade necklaces and ear spools and pectorals were symbols of power, but they were also a physical burden. The stone was cold and heavy against the sweaty skin, creating chafing and discomfort that had to be borne with a stoic face. The housing of the elite was made of stone, which offered some protection from the elements, but the interiors were dark and damp. The thick walls trapped the moisture, and the lack of windows meant that the air inside was often stale and stagnant. Mold grew on the stucco walls, and insects found their way into the bedding and the food stores. Keeping the grain dry was a constant battle against the humidity and the pests. Weevils and rodents would infest the maize supply, turning the hard-won harvest into dust and droppings. The women spent hours sifting through the grain to salvage what they could, their fingers moving deftly through the kernels to pick out the bugs. The fear of starvation was never far away because the Maya relied so heavily on the rains. If the seasonal rains were delayed by even a few weeks, the crops would wither in the fields. The soil of the jungle was thin and poor, quickly depleted of nutrients after a few years of farming. This forced them to constantly clear new land, moving further and further into the forest, destroying the habitat that sustained the animals they hunted. As the population grew, the pressure on the land increased. Trees were cut down faster than they could grow back, causing erosion and changing the local climate. The temperature rose as the shade of the canopy disappeared. The water in the reservoirs evaporated faster, and the cycle of drought became more frequent and more severe. Civil unrest grew as the resources dwindled. The common people began to lose faith in their divine rulers, who could no longer guarantee the rain. The cities became crowded and unsanitary. Waste piled up in the outskirts, polluting the water sources and spreading disease. Dysentery and intestinal parasites were common afflictions that drained the strength of the workers. A simple bout of diarrhea could be a death sentence in a world without rehydration salts. The life expectancy was short, with few people living past the age of 40. Death was a constant companion, buried under the floors of the houses so the ancestors could remain close to the living. The smell of decomposition was masked by the smoke of the cooking fires and the scent of flowers, but the presence of the dead was always felt. The jungle itself was a formidable enemy. Poisonous snakes like the fer-de-lance were masters of camouflage, hiding in the leaf litter where a bare foot could easily step on them. The bite caused necrosis of the flesh and an agonizing death. Jaguars stalked the edges of the villages at night, taking dogs and sometimes children who strayed too far. The howler monkeys screamed from the treetops, a terrifying guttural roar that sounded like the growl of a monster echoing through the mist. Every journey between cities was a risk. The sakbeob, or white roads that connected the major centers, were patrolled, but bandits and enemy warriors often lay in ambush. Travelers carried heavy loads of trade goods on their backs, obsidian and jade and cacao beans and salt, walking for days on blistered feet, sleeping on the hard ground, always listening for the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves that betrayed a hidden danger. The ancient Maya lived in a world of vibrant color and towering architecture, but the foundation of their civilization was built on a bedrock of suffering and endurance, a relentless struggle against a hostile environment and the demands of their own culture, where peace was fleeting and rest was a luxury that few could afford. The silence of the ruins today belies the noise and the pain and the sheer effort that once filled these spaces. The echoes of their brutal lives are lost to time, but the stones remain, cold and hard and enduring,
witnessing the slow passage of centuries, just as the people once witnessed the slow and heavy passage of their days. The trade routes that crisscrossed the empire were arteries of commerce, but for the porters they were paths of endless agony. The white stone roads known as sakbeob reflected the blinding glare of the tropical sun into the eyes of the travelers until their vision blurred and their heads throbbed with a dull and rhythmic pain. These roads were raised above the jungle floor to avoid the floods of the rainy season, but they offered no shade from the midday heat. A porter was expected to carry loads of up to 80 or 90 pounds for 10 hours a day. The weight was supported by the tum line across the forehead, which meant the neck muscles were always tense and the spine was always compressed. Over time, this deformed the vertebrae and caused a permanent stoop. They walked in silence because talking wasted breath. The only sound was the slapping of bare feet or leather sandals against the limestone paving. They carried salt from the coasts and cacao from the humid lowlands and obsidian from the volcanic highlands, goods that were essential for the elite but often out of reach for the men who carried them. The value of a cacao bean was so high it was used as currency, yet the man carrying a sack of them might never taste the rich chocolate drink that was whisked into a froth for the lords. The jungle that bordered the roads was a wall of green that concealed 1,000 minor miseries. There were plants like the chaya, which had stinging hairs that caused an intense burning itch if brushed against, and the Chechen tree, whose sap was toxic and caused blistering rashes that could last for weeks. The very air was filled with invisible spores and molds that attacked the lungs, leading to chronic coughing and respiratory weakness that plagued the population. Inside the cities, the social hierarchy was a rigid cage from which there was no escape. A person's destiny was written in the stars at the moment of their birth and interpreted by the priests who held absolute sway over the minds of the people. If a child was born on an unlucky day, their life was considered cursed from the start. This fatalism permeated every aspect of existence, creating a psychological weight that was just as heavy as the stones they carried. The commoners were forbidden from wearing the finery of the nobility. They could not wear jade or quetzal feathers or jaguar skin. These sumptuary laws were strictly enforced, and a violation could mean severe punishment or death. The legal system was swift and often brutal. There were no prisons to hold criminals, so punishment was usually immediate, ranging from the shaving of the head to signify shame to slavery or execution. A thief might be sold into slavery to pay off the debt of what he stole.
Becoming the property of the victim, his life effectively over as he knew it, the concept of individual freedom was non-existent. Everyone belonged to the family, the clan, the city, and the gods. The pressure to conform was immense. The fear of ostracization kept people in line, for to be cast out of the community was a death sentence in the unforgiving environment of the rainforest. The domestic life of the women was equally grueling and repetitive. Beyond the grinding of the maize, there was the weaving of cotton, which was a tedious and eye-straining task. They used backstrap looms, which required them to sit on the ground for hours with the looms strapped around their waist, the tension of the threads maintained by the weight of their own bodies leaning back. This caused severe back pain and circulation problems in the legs. The cotton had to be spun by hand using a drop spindle, a process that took days to produce enough thread for a simple garment. The dyeing of the fabric involved foul-smelling concoctions made from crushing marine snails or boiling bark and insects. The smell lingered on the hands and in the hair. The cooking was done over open fires inside the unventilated huts. The smoke was a constant irritant, causing eyes to water and sting, and lungs to blacken over time. The walls of the huts were often coated in soot, a visual record of the years of smoke inhalation. Childbirth was a perilous event fraught with danger for both mother and child. The mortality rate was high, and the death of a woman in childbirth was seen as a battle, her spirit akin to a fallen warrior. But for the grieving family, it was a loss of a mother and a worker, adding to the burden of those left behind. The children who survived were put to work as soon as they could walk, carrying water and gathering firewood and chasing birds from the milpa fields. There was no childhood as we know it, only a period of training for the life of labor that lay ahead. As the civilization reached its peak, the environmental pressures became insurmountable. The soil exhaustion led to smaller harvests, the malnutrition became more severe. The skeletons of the people from the late Classic period show signs of severe nutritional stress. They were shorter and their bones were thinner than their ancestors. The elite continued to demand tribute and labor for even larger temples to appease the gods, believing that more stone and more blood would bring back the rain and the fertility of the soil. This disconnect between the rulers and the reality of the land led to a slow societal collapse. The great cities were not destroyed in a single day of fire, but were slowly abandoned, family by family, as the people simply walked away into the forest to find a patch of earth that could still sustain them. The monumental centers that had taken centuries to build were left to the silence of the jungle. The plaster peeled from the walls, the roof combs crumbled, and the roots of the ceiba trees pried the stones apart. The reservoirs that had once held millions of gallons of water filled with silt and debris, becoming breeding grounds for mosquitoes and frogs. The grand plazas where thousands had gathered to watch the rituals were reclaimed by the grass and the vines. The brilliance of the Maya astronomers who had charted the movements of Venus and the moon with incredible accuracy could not save them from the simple reality of hunger. Their intricate calendar, which measured time in cycles of millions of years, continued to turn, but there was no one left to count the days in the great cities. The silence that fell over the ruins was heavy and profound, a silence born of exhaustion and the inevitable victory of nature over the works of man. The brutal life of the Maya was a flash of human brilliance and suffering in the vast timeline of the jungle, a story written in stone and bone and blood that was slowly erased by the relentless growth of the green canopy, leaving only the mystery and the muted echoes of a civilization that had reached for the heavens while its feet were firmly and painfully planted in the unforgiving earth. The humidity eventually rotted away the books made of bark paper, destroying the written history and the accumulated knowledge of centuries, leaving us to piece together their lives from the silent murals and the broken pottery and the scarred bones, a puzzle of pain and beauty that can never be fully solved, only imagined through the lens of the heat and the struggle that defined every waking moment of their existence. The burden of time weighed as heavily on the Maya mind as the stones weighed on their backs, for they believed that time was not a straight line, but a circle of endless repetition where the disasters of the past were destined to return. The priests calculated the cycles with obsessive precision, using the long count calendar to predict the exact day when the world might end or be reborn. This knowledge did not bring comfort, but rather a sense of impending doom that permeated the society. Every sunrise was seen not as a certainty, but as a temporary victory won through blood and prayer. The fear that the sun would simply stop in the sky was a terrifying shadow that hung over the fields and the temples alike. The underworld, known as Xibalba, was not a distant hell, but a physical place located just beneath the earth, accessible through the dark mouths of caves and the deep waters of the cenotes. The common people believed that the lords of Xibalba were constantly waiting to trick and ensnare the souls of the living. Disease was often interpreted as a spectral attack from these subterranean demons, requiring complex and frightening exorcisms involving burning chili peppers and stinging nettles to drive the bad spirits away. The air in the caves was thick and stale, smelling of bat guano and damp limestone, yet people had to venture into them to leave offerings or collect sacred water, creeping through narrow tunnels where the darkness was absolute and the silence was broken only by the dripping of water and the beating of their own terrified hearts. The craftsmanship that we admire today in museums was produced under conditions of extreme physical stress. The potters who created the intricate polychrome vases worked with clay that had to be mined from riverbeds and purified by hand, a process that dried out the skin until it cracked and bled. They sat for hours in cramped workshops, inhaling the dust of the dried clay and the toxic fumes of the mineral pigments used for painting. The master scribes who painted the codices and the vessels held a high status, but their work ruined their eyes, huddled over their bark paper books by the light of flickering torches, straining to draw the microscopic details of the glyphs. The soot from the pine torches filled the room and coated their lungs, leading to a chronic cough that was the hallmark of their trade. The obsidian workers who knapped the blades for spears and knives worked with a material that was sharper than surgical steel. The air in their workshops was filled with razor-sharp flakes of volcanic glass that could blind an eye or slice a foot if stepped on. Their hands were a map of scars, a testament to the danger of their craft. Even the production of the famous Maya blue pigment involved heating special clays in indigo in a process that released noxious smoke. The beauty of the art was born from the suffering of the artist. The social pressure to conform was reinforced by the layout of the cities themselves, which were designed as a physical map of the cosmos. The commoners lived on the periphery in unplanned clusters of huts, while the elite lived in the center near the temples. This physical separation reinforced the idea that the poor were further from the gods and less important in the grand scheme of the universe. The noise of the city was a constant assault on the senses. The barking of dogs, the blowing of conch shells, the chanting of priests, and the wailing of mourners created a cacophony that never truly ceased. The smell was an overwhelming mix of roasting corn and human waste, and burning incense and rotting vegetation. Sanitation in the crowded residential areas was poor, and the runoff from the heavy rains would often wash filth into the living spaces, spreading sickness and misery. As the classic period drew to a close, the environmental collapse accelerated. The deforestation had changed the local weather patterns, leading to less rain and hotter days. The reservoirs dried up into muddy pits where people fought over the last dregs of water. The desperation led to increased warfare, not for captives, but for survival. Cities attacked their neighbors to seize their food stores, and the old codes of honor fell away. The common people found themselves caught between the starving armies and the starving gods. The priests demanded more sacrifices to end the drought, leading to a frantic increase in rituals that failed to bring the rain. The faith in the divine kings shattered as the crops withered and the children died. Eventually, the people simply stopped building. They stopped repairing the temples, they stopped obeying the priests, and they walked away from the great stone cities that had been the center of their world for centuries. The migration away from the collapse was a long and sorrowful journey, families carrying their few possessions on their backs, walking away from the graves of their ancestors and the homes of their birth, moving north towards the coast or dispersing into small hamlets in the forest. The jungle began its slow reclamation immediately. Vines grew over the stelae, covering the faces of the kings who had claimed to be eternal. The roots of the strangler figs wrapped around the temple walls, crushing the limestone blocks. The wooden lintels rotted away, causing the stone roofs to collapse inward. The great plazas where thousands had cheered became silent glades where only the jaguars walked. The silence of the post-collapse world was the silence of a tomb. The brutal noise of civilization was replaced by the indifference of nature. The Maya people did not vanish, but their way of life was irrevocably broken. They returned to a simpler existence of subsistence farming, living in the shadow of the ruins, telling stories of the time when the gods walked the earth and the stones spoke. But the memory of the hardship remained, woven into the fabric of their culture, a resilience born of surviving the end of their world.
The brutal reality of the ancient Maya was not just the physical pain of labor or the violence of war, but the psychological burden of living in a universe that demanded blood for survival, a world where the gods were hungry and the jungle was waiting, and where the only certainty was the rising of the sun and the grinding of the corn, day after day, until the end of time. The jungle was not merely the backdrop for their lives, but a living entity that sought to consume everything they built. The fight against the vegetation was a daily war waged with stone tools and fire. If a farmer turned his back on his field for even a month, the weeds and the vines would choke the maize, reclaiming the land with a speed that was terrifying to behold.
The humidity was a constant weight that pressed against the skin, making the air feel thick enough to drink. Clothing never truly dried, always retaining a damp clamminess that chafed the skin and encouraged fungal infections. The smell of mildew was the perfume of the tropics, permeating the thatched roofs and the cotton mats they slept on. The stone walls of the temples were constantly covered in a green slime of moss and algae that had to be scraped away by hand, a task that fell to the lowest laborers, who spent their days clinging to the steep sides of the pyramids, scrubbing the limestone until their fingers were raw. The water they drank from the chultuns or cisterns was often tepid and tasted of the earth. In the dry season, it would become thick with sediment, forcing them to strain it through cloth to remove the wiggling larvae of mosquitoes. The fear of contamination was an instinctual one, for they knew that bad water brought the sickness of the gut that drained the life from a man in days. The nights were pitch black in a way that modern people can scarcely imagine. Once the fires burned down, there was no light but the stars. The darkness of the hut was absolute, a heavy blanket that hid the scorpions and the spiders that sought shelter from the rain. The sounds of the night were amplified by the darkness, the rustle of dry leaves, the scratching of rodents in the thatch, the distant call of a nightjar. Every sound was a reminder of the wild world that lay just outside the thin walls of the home. The silence of the abandoned cities is now peaceful, but in their time those plazas were filled with the stress of survival. The smoke from thousands of cooking fires would hang over the city in the morning mist, creating a haze that stung the eyes and obscured the sunrise. The sanitation in the dense urban centers was a constant battle. The waste was carried away to the outskirts, but the smell lingered, a mix of organic decay and wood smoke that defined the olfactory landscape of the city. The heavy jewelry of the elite was not just a display of wealth, but a test of endurance. The ear spools stretched the lobes until they hung down to the shoulders, a permanent modification that required one to move the head carefully. The heavy belts of jade and shell weighed down the hips, making walking a slow and deliberate act. The elaborate headdresses made of wood and feathers were so tall and heavy that the wearer had to balance them with extreme care, standing perfectly still for hours during the ceremonies while the tropical sun beat down on them, sweat running into their eyes, which they could not wipe away without breaking the ritual. The scribes who recorded the history painted on codices made of bark paper, but the humidity has destroyed nearly all of these books, leaving us with only the inscriptions on stone. This loss of knowledge is a silence that echoes through history. We know the names of the kings and the dates of their wars, but we have lost the songs of the common people, the recipes of their grandmothers, and the bedtime stories they told their children, all swallowed by the rot of the jungle. The stone tools they used were effective but brittle. An obsidian blade was sharper than steel, but would shatter if it hit bone or stone at the wrong angle, requiring the hunter or warrior to constantly knap new blades, a process that left piles of razor-sharp debris. The life of a Maya woman was one of constant motion. From the waking fire to the sleeping mat, her hands were never still, spinning, weaving, grinding, cooking, carrying, soothing. Her labor was the invisible foundation upon which the entire civilization rested, yet she remains largely invisible in the stone records, which celebrate only the men who held the spears and the scepters. The collapse of the civilization was likely a slow and painful grinding down, rather than a sudden explosion, a gradual realization that the old ways no longer worked,
that the gods were not listening, and that the earth was tired. The people moved away not because they wanted to, but because they had to, leaving the great temples to the monkeys and the vines, the silence returning to the plazas where the ball games had once roared, the jaguar throne covered in dust, the painted walls fading in the damp air, until the cities became indistinguishable from the hills, mounds of green hiding the memories of a people who had endured so much. Their struggle is now part of the soil, the calcium of their bones feeding the roots of the immense ceiba trees that stand guard over the ruins, a cycle of life and death and regrowth that continues in the quiet dark of the forest, indifferent to the rise and fall of kings, marking the passage of time not in katuns or baktuns, but in the slow and steady growth of the moss on the stone.